Hi, E.T. here. This story is very interesting. I'm going to have to kind of wing this using old copies of newspapers, but I promise you it's going to be a fun story. This is Jack Johnson. I don't need to tell you that. The greatest heavyweight of his era, and arguably of any era. He took his title in 1905. I think he was 27. He lost it to Jess Willard. He would be 37. But he continued fighting until retiring in 1931, and at that time he was 53. Yet Johnson was immediately treated as history after losing that title in 1915, and one reason being that Johnson's post-Willard fights were for the most part against very weak opposition. Many had no previous ring experience at all. Although beginning in, I think it was 1926, he'd be, 48? He did take on some tough guys like Bearcat Wright. Who else? Brad Simmons. That was Johnson's last pro fight. It was reported, by the way, that in that last fight with Simmons, that Jack Johnson made, and I'm quoting a newspaper, made a voodoo pass over Brad's head, and then Brad immediately fell down. Well, it was such a scandal that both fighters were barred from fighting in Kansas ever again. It didn't make any difference to Johnson. He was done, except for exhibitions. He continued to do that for over a decade, and often he was making more than loose change. And it kept him in the news, and it kept increasing his popularity among all Americans. And that's sort of the theme of this talk. One of his first post-retirement exhibitions was in E.T.'s hometown of Spokane, Washington, before E.T. was born. The main event, by the way, was a welterweight match between Al Gracio versus Freddie Steele. Steele, at the time, is a rising star. He's soon to be middleweight champion, and a great one. Later honored member of the International Boxing Hall of Fame. Now, E.T. is going to discuss Freddie Steele in a later video. Today it's about the great Jack Johnson. Contrary to popular opinion, today, Johnson was quite popular with Americans of all races. He'd undergone numerous prosecutions, resulting in almost a year of jail time. Now, in 2018, he received a posthumous pardon from President Trump. That, however, was a tad late. Something else, Johnson was remarkably well-spoken, and he seldom spoke ill of any opponent. He was, by the time he retired, the emerging elder statesman of the boxing world. Now, here is how Spokane's Sportsman Review newspaper wrote about the champ. Now, I'm quoting the paper. The headline is, "The great Jack Johnson arrives in the city, his teeth flashing like diamonds in an onyx setting, and his feet as restless as those of a stripling. 55-year-old Jack Johnson, greatest defensive heavyweight champion, was the guest of Spokane today. He arrived during the night, and this morning he pronounced himself ready to meet the best heavyweights that promoter Will Malin can find for tonight's card." Keep in mind, this is the undercard, the exhibition matches, to the Freddie Steele fight. Going on, quoting the paper, Dr. R.E. Dalton examined the 220-pound Johnson and said, and I'm quoting here the doctor, "Johnson has the finest physique and is in the best condition for his years of any man I've ever seen. He could fight many grueling rounds if forced." Now, the review goes on to say that despite the fact that he engaged in more than 90 fights, Johnson is unmarked proof of his uncanny ring skill. His ears, eyebrows, cheekbones, usually torn and scarred by glove cuts, are unblemished. Well, both D. Richmond, who is a 200-pound Chewelah, Washington heavyweight, and Elgin Taylor of Spokane were instructed by the promoter Malin to try to knock out Johnson in a 3-round exhibition event. Now, the review goes on to say that Jack Johnson, I'm quoting, former world heavyweight champion, appeared in a 3-round exhibition just before the main event. The more than 50-year-old Johnson does not look his age, Well, there's a tendency toward a waistline that does come with age. He's still an athlete and far more lithe and nimble of foot than one would expect after more than half a century, which included a long and active career. Johnson was accorded, going on to reading the paper, was accorded quite a reception by the big crowd as he made his way to the ring from his dressing room. He was clad in a blue robe. Johnson, with a shining bald head, nodded in appreciation of the friendly greeting. The promoter, Will Malin, silenced the crowd to introduce the former champion. And Johnson proved, says the paper, to be quite a speaker. He started his remarks with a warning. He said he would stop talking the minute any hoodlum attempted to interrupt him. And, said the paper, it apparently had the desired effect, for none of the usual wisecrackers so prevalent at boxing shows made a sound until Jack Johnson finished his talk. He confined, said the paper, his remarks principally to thanking the crowd for the warm greeting. He praised the people of Washington State. He said, the finest I have ever come in contact with. Then he answered questions. One man shouted, "What about Willard?" Johnson said, "I couldn't catch him." Another man yells out, "What about Ketchel?" Now that's referring to middleweight Stanley Ketchel, who floored Johnson and was later knocked out. Johnson replied, "Well, I caught him." Now Johnson earlier, and before he got into the ring, told out-of-town newspapers that the recent Max Schmeling versus Young Stribling fight surprised him. Johnson said, and I'm quoting Johnson, "Schmeling isn't really a great fighter. Stribling should have whipped him. Max is a willing boy, but he will never be a great champion because he isn't a polished fighter." Now, I should add here that a few years later, former champion Max Schmeling did knock out Joe Louis. Joe Louis, however, revenged that in a most famous encounter. Anyway, going on with the paper, Johnson also surprised reporters about his long ago 2 20-round battles with Hank Griffin, one in Oakland, one in San Francisco. Johnson said these words, "Most fans have forgotten Griffin, but he was a great fighter. We were made to order for each other, and every time either one of us swung, we connected. We stood toe-to-toe for 20 rounds on 2 occasions. I will never forget those grueling rounds." I should add here that Griffin fought I think it was a 4-round fight with James J. Jeffries, and both claimed that each had won. But Griffin, according to most there, probably had a slight edge over James J. Jeffries. So what about that much anticipated exhibition with Johnson taking on local toughs? Well, he took on one. And one paper, I think it was his Seattle paper, reported this. I think it was a week before the fight. It was a headline, "Wanted, 2 fearless, hard-swinging heavyweights, willing to mix with Jack Johnson, former heavyweight champion of the world." And then it goes on to say that the promoter, Will Malin, is combing the ranks of the Inland Empire for 2 courageous souls to spar with the famed Jack Johnson Thursday night. And then it quoted Johnson, "I want him big, I want him rugged." Then Malin said, "Johnson wants to fight. He doesn't want to bother around with an exhibition." Well, what about the exhibition? It turned out to be not much, but it was fun nonetheless. It gave the crowd, according to the Daily Chronicle in Spokane, some idea of what, and I'm quoting, "great speed Johnson had in his active ring days of 20 years ago. He played with fighter D. Richmond and carried on impromptu repartee with ringsiders who joked with him regarding some of his former fights." Again, quoting the Spokesman Review, "Washington and the Northwest was very much impressed with Jack Johnson." And then they quote Johnson, "I have lived all over the U.S. and in nearly every European capital, but I've never encountered such a fine place to live as this state of Washington." Unquote. And that, boys and girls, is the story. Jack Johnson, contrary to much being reported in recent years, was in his post-retirement extremely popular, not just with boxing fans, but within much of the general public that was familiar with the very unfair treatment that Johnson got during his fighting years. And that's it. Don't forget to hit the thumb up icon, tap the bell to be notified of new uploads, subscribe, and comment below. Thank you.